Okay, today I'm in Birmingham with Chris Pitt. Chris, thanks very much for agreeing to talk to us today.
Pleasure.
So you're a man steeped in racing, based in the sprawling metropolis that is Birmingham, but Birmingham was where you first went racing.
Yeah, back in June 1962, I absolutely loved it. The top jockeys were there: Doug and Eve Smith, Greville Starkey, Duncan Keith, Willie Snaith, and it was wonderful. I remember catching the bus from the Hall of Memory in Birmingham. We got to the track. We just missed the first race, and the second race was a four-horse seller won by a horse called Miss Murray, ridden by Davy Jones, who was mid-50s by then. But it could have been the Derby. It was just none of the horses ever won a race again, but it was just great to be there. From the very moment I stepped on the course, I loved it.
And what was it for you that really hooked you?
It was the horses and the jockeys, particularly the jockeys. Um, Always more into them really. I remember back in 1962, my mother wrote to a guy who was my favourite jockey at the time. His name Keith Temple Nid, probably because of the unusual name, and she wrote to him at Birmingham saying, please could, she saw what he was riding there, please could I have your autograph? And then he sent me back this wonderful little thing back in 1962 that he'd got all the jockeys at the weighing room to sign, and they were Brian Taylor, Joe Stein, Edward Hyde, Greville Starkey, Dennis Ryan, inside Jeff Lewis and Bruce Raymond, Sammy Milbanks, and there we are, 1962, all the best AK Temple Nid. And I mean, from then, it was all about the jockeys. I do remember back in that November 61, when my first year really getting stuck into this, was when I'd got used in the summer to Piggott, Breesley, Mercer, and suddenly these names, Winter, Biddlecombe, Gifford, started appearing. And I said to my mum, who are these people? And she said, oh, they ride over jumps. And from that moment, oh, they were my heroes.
So we're going right back to the beginning before
Yeah.
we get right stuck into the racing again. You were born on Easter Monday, in 6th of April 1953. I'm told the midwife had somewhere else to be.
It could have been apocryphal. I don't know. I was there at the time, but I don't remember much about it. But yeah, apparently he or she was going to Birmingham races on the afternoon, being a bank holiday, and there was also allegedly, and this is far fetched, that the midwife apparently was named a Miss Bullock, and my mum always maintained that she was the sister of Johnny Bullock, who'd ridden the Grand National winner 2 years before, Nickel Coin. Whether that's true, I've no idea, but it's a good story.
You're an historian. I thought you would have delved into that. No, so you were 9 years old when you went to Birmingham races for the first time. I mean, not many people that are watching this will have ever been to Birmingham races. So give us a quick description of what it was like.
It was wonderful. It was right-handed, at mile and 3 furlong ground on the flat course, mile and a quarter jumps track on the inner. Perfectly flat, probably the best straight mile outside of Newmarket. You didn't get many false results there because it was a good wide course. It was great. I used to go on the inside, and it was just wonderful atmosphere. They had everything there. They had evening meetings, bank holiday meetings, trying to attract the crowds. And they had a creche where you could keep the kids. I was obviously not going in there. I was on the course. And then when the pop music boom started, they had a mound in the middle of the track, and I remember seeing the Swinging Blue Jeans there, and another band called the McGill Five. So they were ahead of the game in everything, really, in having the pop groups there, the concerts. Even had sort of ladies' nights, which were about admitting ladies for free. So it was well ahead of its time.
So I understand it's now under Spaghetti Junction somewhere.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. If you know where to look, you can just about find the remains of the paddock. But all of the roads around there are named after Derby winners, Grand National winners, or famous racecourses at Cheltenham Drive or Reynoldstown Road. So it's quite nostalgic in that way.
So it wasn't closed because it was a failure, just because they needed the infrastructure.
The people who had worked in Birmingham, even the greatest fan wouldn't have said it was the most scenic racecourse of all time. And by the early 60s, more people had got cars and they wanted to make it a day out, so they'd go to Warwick and Worcester and Ludlow and Hereford, and they stopped going to Birmingham at the same time that the corporation was looking for a site to build 1,500 houses as part of the slum clearance programme. You had a 380-acre site at Bromford Bridge, which was surrounded on part by housing. And so when the council offered £1.25 million for Birmingham, the director snapped the hands off, and that's why racing finished.
Okay, so you were, how did you get into it in the first place?
Into racing, well, I suppose when betting shops were legalised in May '61, my mum and dad would go have their tanner each way doubles and watch it on the television. And that, I think, is where I started watching it. The first race I really remember watching live was the 1961 King George, where Royal beat the previous year's Derby winner St Paddy. And from then, I was hooked on watching racing and going racing.
Yeah, there's an anecdote you wanted to share that you saw on the TV from Redcar.
There was an interesting one because the ITV often used to cover racing from Redcar, and when they had the straight mile races, when you look at it now, there are houses directly at the back, but in those days, in the 60s, it was just bare land, fields and that. And for about a year or two, whenever there was a straight mile race, there was a couple who stood behind the start in the land at the back, waving semaphore flags. And Tony Cook, who was the commentator, used to say, well, there's our friends again. I wonder what it's all about. And eventually, about 18 months later, they found out that they'd got friends in London who weren't on the phone, and they were simply trying to relay the news. We're in very good health, thank you very much. Johnny's passed his exams, the cat's had 5 kittens, and that's what it was about.
No, you actually had a family connection that was involved with racehorses.
I did. My uncle Stan, to who I owe an awful lot. Um, he taught me, I think, how to behave and conduct myself around people, and took a teenage long-haired blockhead that I was, and sort of turned me into something else. When I was 11, he gave me a Christmas present. He gave me a scrapbook that he compiled between 1942 and 52. And I still have it upstairs. When I got it, every other Christmas present I'd had before or since paled into insignificance. I pored over the pages and the articles, and they just meant so much. And yeah, he worked at as head man at 2 important studs. One was at Stetchworth, just outside Newmarket, and I was there in the summer of '64. And I remember Sir Gordon Richards coming to look at the yearlings, and spotty little youth managed to get my photograph taken with Sir Gordon. It's not a great representation, but there's me, horrible little 11-year-old, and Sir Gordon. And then he went to Langham Hall Stud, Tom Blackwell's, where they had some really nice horses. They tended to sell the colts and keep the fillies. The best they had was a filly named VL, who was second to Byreem in the 1980 Oaks. Should have won. Leicester wanted to ride her, but the owner kept loyal to the stable jockey. They had Princess Eberly, who won the Lancashire and Cheshire Oaks. Huntston won the Cheshire Oaks. Jupiter Pluvius, the Chester Vase, the Goodwood Cup with Richmond Fair. So they had some really good horses, 2 that were placed in the Guineas in the 70s. And going there and seeing these horses as foals and as yearlings, I mean, that was just tremendous.
Your memory is amazing.
Well, it's something when you grow up with these things, it just it's part of you. You absorb it rather than learn it, I think.
Yeah. Now you told me that your racing hero when you were growing up was somebody we wouldn't have heard of. So I'm assuming it wasn't Sir Gordon Richards.
It wasn't. Me being me, when I saw the list of jockeys in the papers, ITV used to cover a lot more northern racing in those days, and the jockeys like Stan Hayhurst and Jerry Scott and George Milburn were terrific. And there was this one guy who'd maybe get 1 ride a fortnight, and he'd have a winner a year or a winner every 2 years. And those were the sort of people that I latched onto. So this particular guy, I kept a record of every ride he had. What I didn't know was that his best of his career was behind him, and in the 50s he'd won the Ida Chase, been placed in the Topham. And when in 1965 he actually had a ride in the Grand National on this 100-to-1 no hoper whatsoever, the rest of the Grand National just meant nothing to me. I just wanted to see how he got on. And when he actually was in the lead over about a third fence, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. Needless to say, capsized at Beecher's and brought down 4 others with him. And I followed his career up until he retired in 1968. and thought no more about it. And then through a series of surreal circumstances, in a way, I went to this particular sporting event called the Kipling Coates Derby one year, and this lady introduced herself and said she was getting married to this fella, and I said, "Well, isn't that the son of La?" And she said, "Yeah." And then following her produced A Long Time Gone for me to sign to him, and I thought, I've got to meet this man. And Mary and I went up to Wigton where he lived, and we met him. And I presented him with a list of not every winner he'd ever had, every ride he'd ever had. And he said, "Would you like to see my scrapbook?" I was telling him who the horses were. And it was that he'd ridden 33 winners in 13 years. He was amazed that anyone would ever remember him. But for me, he was an absolute hero. I made sure that he was a chapter in my book, Go Down to the Beaten. And we went up and stayed several times. We exchanged Christmas cards and everything. And he was someone that, when he'd retired, he worked in a tyre factory for 20 years. He didn't regard himself as being anything special, but I did. And it was quite a sad end, in as much as I spoke to him in July one year and said, "Look, I'm holding a Grand National preview next year in April. Please, will you come down?" He said, "I'll think about it." I went to ring him again in September, and about a week before, received a letter saying that he'd died in tragic circumstances. And that hit quite hard. But, I haven't even mentioned his name. People will be able to look it up. His name was John Hudson. Wouldn't have meant anything to you or most people, but he was a hero to me.
Right. So that's obviously means a lot to you there. Right. So we've got to move on. When did you decide that you were going to make a living out of your passion?
I never did. It was never an intention. I worked for British Telecom for over 30 years. Did everything from arranging driving instructors programs to putting in pay systems to selling land and doing disputes over territory and everything by how to mend a telephone. And then when I finished that with them in 2000, did something else for a few years, by which time Boss magazine had been, my wife Mary had taken over as the editor, and I just became the feature writer through having done occasional articles prior to that.
Okay, so you sort of broke into it after you finished with the telecom, but you were already doing stuff before that.
Yeah, I'd already published A Long Time Gone.
That was 1996.
1996, that's
Yeah.
right, before I left BT. But all the other books have then been since 2003, when I decided that I could set myself up as a freelance writer.
Okay, now you've described a lot of long gone racecourses and what was your debut, and now renowned work, A Long Time Gone. Was it inspired by the fact that you were only able to enjoy Birmingham for 3 years?
Not specifically, it was more about an old Shropshire racecourse called War, which had closed 2 years earlier in 1963. And I can't even remember how it happened, but I ended up interviewing the former racecourse manager at War and turned it into an article that was published, I think, in Boss magazine about 1981-82, first thing I'd ever had published. And then former racing club, which I will come on to later, which I formed a few years later, I just started writing an occasional piece in the monthly newsletters until someone said, "Why don't you turn this into a book of some sort?" And that's how A Long Time Gone came about. It took a long while to write. It took about 7 years to write. The interesting thing is, it very nearly didn't see the light of day, and quite an involved story about that. But essentially, it involved a furtive meeting in the service station on the M6 motorway one day when the original publishers had gone bust, and they were handing me all the stuff prior to the receivers coming in the next day. Otherwise, there'd have been no text, no photos, no plans. The lot would have gone. So lucky to ever came to see the light of day.